I thought I was going to die. I had just signed a contract with the Felid Empire, a species known across the galaxy as ruthless, cold-blooded hunters. I expected to be working for 8-foot-tall tiger warriors who would eat me if I fixed the server wrong. But when the airlock opened, I realized the deadliest commanders in the sector were just 4-pound kittens who needed me to reach the top shelf. David stood in front of the massive steel blast doors of Station 42 Alpha, and he was absolutely terrified. His hands were shaking so much that he almost dropped his heavy duffel bag. He wiped his sweaty palms on his standard-issue blue jumpsuit and took a deep, shaky breath. When he had applied for this job, the description just said, Systems Administrator. It seemed like a normal IT job. It was only after he signed the contract that he read the fine print. The station was owned by the Felid Empire. David had done some research on the flight over, and the results gave him nightmares. The Felids were known across the galaxy as ruthless, efficient hunters. In his mind, David pictured 8-foot-tall tigers walking on 2 legs, wearing power armor and holding laser rifles. He imagined they would eat him for a snack if he was 5 minutes late fixing the Wi-Fi. The heavy metal door hissed and slowly slid open. David braced himself. He stepped into the room, expecting to see a room full of scary warrior beasts. Instead, he stepped into total darkness. The air inside the room was freezing cold. It felt more like a refrigerator than an office. The only light came from the blinking red lights of the server towers in the back. David shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. He took a hesitant step forward into the gloom. He couldn't see anyone, but he felt eyes watching him. He felt like a mouse walking into a trap. Suddenly, a voice boomed out of the darkness. It was a deep, robotic, and terrifying voice that echoed off the metal walls. Identify yourself, biological unit, the voice commanded. David jumped nearly a foot in the air. He dropped his bag with a loud thud. He tried to speak, but his voice was just a squeak. He cleared his throat and tried again. I am David. The new IT specialist. Please don't eat me. There was a long, heavy silence. David closed his eyes, waiting for a giant claw to grab him. Lights, the robotic voice commanded. The overhead lights flickered and buzzed to life, flooding the room with bright white light. David squinted and raised his hands to protect his face. Slowly, he lowered his hands to look at his new bosses. He looked up at the ceiling, expecting giants. There was nothing there. He looked at eye level. Nothing there. Then, he heard a soft sound, like a frustrated sigh. He looked down. There, sitting on a high-tech floating desk in the center of the room, was a cat. It wasn't a tiger. It wasn't a lion. It was a small, fluffy calico cat that couldn't have weighed more than 8 pounds. She was wearing a tiny, sleek silver collar around her neck. As David stared with his mouth open, the cat tapped the collar with a white paw. The deep, scary robotic voice spoke again, coming directly from the small collar. I am Captain Mochi, the cat said. And you are late, human. David blinked. His brain could not process what he was seeing. You are the captain, he asked. Before Mochi could answer, a gray-striped tabby cat dropped down from a high shelf and landed perfectly on the desk. This one looked at David with narrow, suspicious eyes. A third cat, a black and white tuxedo kitten, slid out from under a chair and ran into David's leg, sniffing his boot excitedly. That is Lieutenant Bella, Captain Mochi said, her collar translating her meows into the scary robot voice. And the one attacking your foot is Ensign Pip. We are the command crew of this sector. David looked at the 3 small creatures. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by confusion. These were the ruthless killers. The deadly Felid Empire. They looked like they belonged on a calendar in a grandma's house. I don't understand, David said, relaxing his shoulders. I thought you would be bigger. Captain Mochi stood up and puffed out her chest. She looked very offended. Size is irrelevant, she stated. We are apex predators. We run the most complex logic systems in the galaxy. But we have a problem. A biological problem. Is it the servers? David asked, stepping forward. I can fix the code. No, Lieutenant Bella said. Her voice translator sounded raspy and angry. It is the environment. The computers require the room to be freezing cold. But we are desert creatures. We are freezing to death. David looked at them. They were indeed shivering slightly. Their fur was puffed up to keep warm. Suddenly, the three cats stopped looking at David's face and started looking at his body. They stared at him with intense, hungry eyes. David got nervous again. Why are you looking at me like that? Ensign Pip, the tuxedo cat, stood on his hind legs and pawed at David's knee. He is hot, Pip chirped. The giant radiates heat. He is a walking furnace. Captain Mochi's eyes dilated until they were almost entirely black. She looked at David not as an employee, but as a piece of furniture. Scanner confirms, Mochi said. Core body temperature is 98.6 degrees. He is perfect. David realized then that he hadn't been hired for his brain. He hadn't been hired for his coding skills. He looked at the three freezing cats who were slowly creeping toward him with desperate looks on their faces. He was just a giant, living heating pad. And his job had just begun. The first week at Station 42 Alpha was not what David had expected from a high-tech government job. He thought he would be coding firewalls or fighting off cyber attacks from rogue AI. Instead, his primary struggle was trying to type a single line of code without being assaulted by his superior officers. The station was kept at a freezing temperature to ensure the massive server banks didn't overheat, which made the environment perfect for machines but miserable for biological life. David, being a human from a temperate planet, could handle the chill by wearing an extra sweater. His roommates, however, were suffering. The cats were evolved from desert ancestors, and to them, the server room was basically an Arctic wasteland. This meant that any source of warmth was considered a tactical asset, and David was the biggest heat source in the room. David sat at his desk, hunching his shoulders against the cold draft blowing from the ventilation shaft. He was trying to update the station's navigation software, a delicate task that required focus. Suddenly, a gray blur shot across his vision. Lieutenant Bella landed directly on his keyboard with a soft clack-clack-clack of claws hitting plastic keys. The screen instantly filled with gibberish code. David sighed and gently tried to push the gray tabby aside. Bella dug her claws into the desk mat and refused to move. Her collar crackled with her raspy, synthesized voice. She declared that she was performing a mandatory security inspection of the input device. She claimed the mouse cursor was a digital parasite that needed to be hunted. David knew she was lying, she just wanted to sit on his wrists because the blood flow made them warm. Giving up on work for the moment, David spun his chair around and decided to take a break. He stood up to stretch his stiff back, his joints popping in the silence of the room. As soon as he stood, 3 pairs of ears swiveled toward him like radar dishes. Captain Mochi was perched on top of a warm server tower, but it wasn't warm enough. Ensign Pip was shivering under a desk lamp. When David moved, they saw a massive, walking radiator. David walked over to the corner of the room where he had thrown a few beanbag chairs to make a lounge area. He sat down, letting out a long sigh of exhaustion. He closed his eyes for a second, just wanting to rest. That was his mistake. He had opened the gates. Tactical Formation Alpha. Captain Mochi's robotic voice boomed across the room. The giant has grounded. Engage. Engage. Before David could open his eyes, he felt the impact. It wasn't a violent attack, but it was heavy. Ensign Pip, the clumsy tuxedo cat, was the first to arrive. He didn't even jump, he just scrambled up David's leg like he was climbing a tree, his small claws pricking through the denim of David's jumpsuit. Pip circled 3 times on David's lap, kneading the fabric with serious determination, before collapsing into a black and white ball of fluff. The warmth from the small cat was immediate, but the invasion wasn't over. Lieutenant Bella came next. She was more agile and commanded more respect. She didn't settle for the legs. She leaped from the back of the couch and landed squarely on David's chest. The air was knocked out of him with a oomph sound. Bella stared him right in the face, her nose only an inch from his. She sniffed him aggressively, checking for weakness, before flopping down right across his sternum. Her weight pinned him to the beanbag. Finally, Captain Mochi arrived. She walked slowly, with dignity, climbing over David's arm. She inspected the pile of cats, nodded her approval, and then claimed the highest ground. She climbed onto David's shoulder and wrapped herself around the back of his neck like a fur scarf. David was now completely immobilized. He was covered in about 25 pounds of alien feline. The sound in the room changed. The hum of the servers was drowned out by a synchronized, deep rumbling sound. All 3 cats began to purr at the same time. It sounded like a diesel engine idling. To the cats, this wasn't cuddling, this was survival. Captain Mochi's caller spoke softly, her voice lowered to a whisper. She explained that human biology was a marvel of engineering. She called him a Class A thermal reactor. To them, David wasn't just a roommate, he was a walking nuclear power plant that generated a consistent 98 degrees of life-saving heat. David lay there for 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling. His leg was starting to fall asleep under Pip's weight, and cat hair was definitely getting up his nose thanks to Mochi. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was time for his lunch break. He felt a rumbling in his own stomach. Carefully, he tried to shift his weight to stand up. "I need to get a sandwich," he whispered. Immediately, the purring stopped. 3 pairs of eyes snapped open. The atmosphere in the room turned dangerous. Captain Mochi's claws extended just a tiny bit into his shoulder. Her robotic voice was cold and absolute. She informed him that movement during the recharge protocol was a court-martial offense. She warned him that if he broke the formation, he would be charged with treason against the Empire. David sighed, relaxed his muscles, and accepted his fate. He wasn't going anywhere. The peace of the server room was shattered 3 days later by a sound that made David's blood run cold. He had been quietly eating a bagel while Captain Mochi napped on his printer, but suddenly, the station's emergency klaxons began to blare. A harsh, rhythmic siren pulsed through the air, and the standard white lighting of the room was instantly replaced by a rotating, ominous crimson glare. David dropped his bagel, his heart hammering against his ribs as he scrambled to his feet. He expected a hull breach, a fire, or perhaps an invasion fleet docking at the airlock. He looked to his commanding officers for guidance, expecting cool-headed tactical orders. What he saw instead was pure, unadulterated panic. Captain Mochi had abandoned her dignity entirely. She was currently arched like a Halloween cat on top of the highest server rack, her fur puffed out so much that she looked twice her normal size. Her tail was bristled like a bottle brush, and she was hissing at the closed door. Lieutenant Bella was nowhere to be seen, having seemingly dissolved into the shadows, while Ensign Pip was scrambling frantically on the polished floor, his claws losing traction as he tried to find a hiding spot. David grabbed his heavy metal wrench from the tool belt, his knuckles turning white. If the elite Felid officers were this terrified, whatever was on the other side of that door must be a nightmare. He moved to the center of the room, ready to defend his small roommates with his life. "Report." David yelled over the siren, trying to sound brave. Captain Mochi's caller projected her voice, but the robotic tone was shaking. She announced that the sensors had detected a Class 5 predator in Corridor B. She called it the Loud Devourer. According to her, it was an unstoppable beast that screamed as it consumed everything in its path. It had no eyes, no face, only a gaping maw that sucked the very soul out of the station. She ordered David, as the resident heavy worlder giant, to intercept the target. She claimed that his dense bone structure might be enough to choke the beast if it tried to eat him. It wasn't exactly a vote of confidence, but David nodded grimly. He was the tank. It was his job to hold the line. David moved toward the door, the heavy wrench raised high. He pressed the release button, and the blast door slid open. The corridor beyond was bathed in red emergency light. He stepped out, listening. At first, he heard nothing but the hum of the station. Then, he heard it. It was a low, mechanical growling sound coming from around the corner. Whir. Thud. Whir. Thud. The sound was getting louder. It sounded relentless, mindless. David swallowed the lump in his throat. He crept forward, hugging the wall, prepared to swing his wrench at a xenomorph or a cyborg soldier. He rounded the corner, screaming a war cry to intimidate the enemy. He froze mid-scream. The wrench lowered slowly in his hand. There, at the end of the hallway, was the terrible beast. It was a small, round, plastic disc. It was a standard-issue automated cleaning drone, an older model that looked exactly like a robotic vacuum cleaner from Earth. It had apparently malfunctioned and escaped the maintenance closet. The screaming was just its vacuum motor running on high power, and the terrifying thudding sound was the robot bumping into the wall, turning slightly, and bumping into the wall again. It was currently stuck in a loop, aggressively trying to suck up a stray piece of wire while banging its head against a bulkhead. David stood there for a moment, blinking in confusion. He looked back at the server room door where 3 pairs of glowing eyes were peeking out from the bottom. To the cats, this noisy, sucking machine was the apex of horror. To David, it was a household appliance. He walked up to the loud devourer. The robot didn't attack, it just bumped into David's boot with a gentle bonk. David sighed, bent down, and pressed the large power button on the top of the unit. The whirring noise died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy. David picked up the cleaning drone by its handle, tucking it under his arm like a football. He walked back into the server room carrying the defeated enemy. The reaction was immediate. Captain Mochi jumped down from the server rack, her eyes wide with awe. Lieutenant Bella emerged from the shadows, approaching David with cautious respect. They circled him, sniffing the silent machine. In their eyes, David had just wrestled a dragon into submission with his bare hands. He had silenced the screamer without suffering a single scratch. Ensign Pip was so overcome with hero worship that he ran off and returned a moment later, dropping a dead space cockroach at David's feet as a tribute. David looked at the bug, then at the vacuum, and finally at the proud faces of his alien sisters. He realized that being a hero didn't always mean fighting monsters, sometimes, it just meant being the only one brave enough to turn off the vacuum cleaner. The laughter from the vacuum cleaner incident didn't last long. 2 weeks later, Station 42 Alpha faced a crisis that no amount of bravery or heavy wrenches could fix easily. It started with a sound that every spacer dreads, the sudden, heavy thud of the main power relays tripping offline, followed by absolute, suffocating silence. The constant hum of the ventilation fans died instantly. The cheerful beeping of the consoles vanished. Even the emergency red lights failed to trigger immediately. For 10 seconds, David and his 3 feline roommates were plunged into a darkness so complete it felt heavy. Then, the auxiliary battery kicked in, bathing the room in a dim, ghostly blue light, but the damage was already done. The life support systems had crashed. And on a space station, when the life support dies, the cold comes rushing in like a physical blow. David immediately rushed to the manual override console, his fingers flying across the dark glass of the touchscreen. His breath was already starting to mist in the air, creating small white clouds with every exhale. The temperature wasn't just dropping, it was plummeting. The station's insulation was designed to keep heat out to protect the servers, not to keep heat in for the crew. David checked the diagnostics and cursed under his breath. The fusion core had initiated an emergency shutdown. It would take at least 2 hours to reboot the cycle safely. For a human from Earth, 2 hours in sub-zero temperatures was dangerous and miserable, but survivable. Humans were sturdy, thick-skinned creatures evolved to survive ice ages. For the Felid crew, however, this was a death sentence. He turned to look at his roommates, and his heart hammered in his chest. The change in them was terrifyingly fast. Captain Mochi, usually so full of energy and loud orders, was curled into a tight ball on her command chair. She wasn't shivering. Shivering was good, shivering meant the body was fighting. She was perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, her breathing shallow and slow. Lieutenant Bella was trying to burrow under a pile of data pads, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated, like a toy with low batteries. Ensign Pip, the smallest of them all, had collapsed on the floor halfway to David, too weak to make it to the beanbag chair. The Felid biology was built for hot sands and scorching suns. They had almost no body fat and a metabolism that burned out instantly in the cold. They weren't just uncomfortable, they were beginning to die. David knew he couldn't fix the reactor in time. If he stayed at the console typing code, he would be the only one left alive when the lights came back on. He made a choice. He abandoned his post. He grabbed the thermal blanket from his emergency kit, but he knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. The blanket trapped heat, but the cats had no heat left to trap. They needed an external source. They needed a furnace. David unzipped his thick, standard-issue jumpsuit down to his waist. He scooped up Ensign Pip first. The little tuxedo cat felt like a block of ice. It was shocking how cold he was. David tucked Pip inside his jumpsuit, pressing the small cat directly against his warm skin. Pip didn't even protest, he just hung there, limp and fragile. Next, David grabbed Lieutenant Bella and shoved her in on the left side. Finally, he picked up Captain Mochi. She opened one green eye, looking at him with a mixture of confusion and fear, but she didn't have the strength to hiss. He tucked her in on the right side, right against his chest. With all 3 cats stuffed inside his clothes, David zipped the jumpsuit up as far as it would go, leaving only their heads poking out near his neck. He wrapped the thermal blanket tightly around his own shoulders and sat down in the corner of the room, curling his legs up to conserve every ounce of heat he had. The first 20 minutes were agonizing. David sat in the freezing dark, his own teeth chattering violently. He could feel the icy chill of the cat's fur against his skin, sucking the warmth right out of him. It felt like hugging 3 snowballs. He rubbed their backs through the fabric of his suit, whispering stupid, comforting things to them. He told them about summer days on Earth, about fireplaces, about lying on warm pavement. He focused on being a radiator. He focused on the fact that he was a human, a monster from a high-gravity death world, and he refused to let the cold win. Slowly, painfully, the dynamic shifted. The shivering started. First Pip, then Bella, then Mochi. They began to tremble against his chest. It was a good sign. It meant their systems were coming back online. David held them tighter. Then, he felt it, a small, rhythmic vibration against his ribs. Pip had started to purr. It was weak and shaky, but it was there. Mochi shifted, digging her cold nose into David's neck, seeking the heat of his pulse. She didn't give an order. She didn't threaten him. For the first time, she simply let out a soft, grateful mew. They stayed like that for hours, a huddle of alien life clinging to the one thing in the universe that could keep them safe, their giant, warm, human brother. When the lights finally flickered back on and the heaters began to hum, David didn't move. And neither did they. They knew exactly who had saved them. Life on Station 42 Alpha returned to normal after the Great Freeze, but the dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. Before the blackout, David was viewed as a useful piece of furniture or a servant who could open jars. Now, he was the pack's designated survivor. Captain Mochi no longer sat on the high server racks to supervise him, she moved her command post to the corner of his desk, sleeping within arm's reach at all times. Lieutenant Bella stopped attacking his ankles and started bringing him gifts of spare wires and bolts she found in the vents. Even Ensign Pip, the clumsy tuxedo cat, followed David to the bathroom and stood guard outside the door. They were a family now, knit together by shared trauma and body heat. However, their newfound peace was about to be tested by the most terrifying force in the bureaucracy, a surprise military inspection. The docking clamps groaned as a heavy transport ship latched onto the station's airlock. The computer announced the arrival of General Vark of the Wolf Pack Coalition. The Wolf Pack was an ally of the Felid Empire, but they were rivals in every sense that mattered. If the Felids were known for stealth and precision, the Wolves were known for brute strength and noise. The door to the server room hissed open, and General Vark ducked to enter. He was massive. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in thick, coarse gray fur, with a long snout full of jagged teeth. He wore heavy combat armor that clanked with every step, and he smelled intensely of wet dog, oil, and aggression. He towered over the room, casting a long shadow that swallowed the 3 small cats. Captain Mochi stood on the edge of the central desk. She tried to look commanding. She puffed out her chest, her tail held high and straight. General Vark, her caller announced, though the robotic voice sounded tinny compared to the general's booming presence. Station 42 Alpha reports optimal efficiency. We are prepared for inspection. The general didn't salute. He didn't even nod. He looked down at the small calico cat and let out a bark of laughter that shook the walls. He sneered, his lip curling back to reveal terrifying fangs. Efficiency? Vark rumbled, his voice like gravel in a blender. I see a nursery. The High Command sends kittens to run a military outpost. This is an insult to the uniform. Vark stepped forward, ignoring Mochi's authority. He swept a massive, clawed hand across the desk, knocking over a stack of carefully organized data pads. They crashed to the floor with a loud clatter. Ensign Pip squeaked and hid under the chair. Lieutenant Bella hissed, her ears flattened, but she backed away. Instinct took over. In the wild, a wolf eats a cat. The size difference was simply too great. Vark laughed again, kicking a small water bowl across the room, spilling water everywhere. Weak, Vark growled. You are small. You are fragile. I should recommend this station be decommissioned and turned into a storage closet. You are not warriors. You are pets. David had been kneeling behind a server rack, quietly fixing a loose cable. He had stayed out of sight, following the protocol to let the officers handle official business. But when the water bowl went flying, something snapped in his brain. It was a primal, ancient switch that flipped deep in his DNA. Humans are pack bonders. They will pack bond with anything, a dog, a cat, a robot vacuum, a rock. And on Earth, the rule was simple, nobody hurts the pack. David stood up. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have armor. He was wearing a rumpled blue jumpsuit and holding a screwdriver. But as he stepped out from behind the rack, he didn't look like an IT guy. He looked like an angry ape. David walked straight toward General Vark. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked with a heavy, purposeful stomp. The general stopped laughing and turned to look at the human. Vark was taller, yes, but David was wider at the shoulders, and humans were incredibly dense creatures compared to most aliens. David stepped right into the general's personal space. This was an aggressive move in any culture. He stood toe-to-toe with the giant wolf, craning his neck up to look him in the eye. David didn't blink. He channeled every ounce of disappointed dad energy he possessed. Pick it up, David said. His voice was low, flat, and dangerously calm. The general blinked, confused. Excuse me, primate? I said, pick it up, David repeated, pointing the screwdriver at the messy data pads on the floor. And apologized to the captain. The room went dead silent. The three cats stared in horror, expecting David to be torn in half. But General Vark didn't attack. He hesitated. In the animal kingdom, if a smaller creature isn't afraid of a bigger predator, it usually means the smaller creature is poisonous, crazy, or hiding a weapon. David took another step forward, forcing the general to take a step back. You think they are weak because they are small? David lied smoothly, staring into the wolf's yellow eyes. I am a Deathworlder. I come from Earth. I have crushed skulls with my hands. And I take orders from these cats. If I am terrified of them, General, imagine what they could do to you. The bluff hung in the air. The general looked at David's crazy, unblinking eyes. He looked at the heavy wrench hanging on David's belt. He looked at the small cats who commanded this monster. The general's ears lowered. He swallowed hard. The logic was sound. If a human served the cats must be secret monsters. I see, Vark stammered, his confidence breaking. Perhaps I misjudged the situation. The general quickly bent down, his armor clanking, and awkwardly picked up the data pads. He placed them back on the desk. He gave a stiff, hurried salute to Captain Mochi. Carry on, Captain, Vark mumbled, and then he turned and practically ran out of the room, the door hissing shut behind him. David exhaled, his knees shaking slightly as the adrenaline faded. He turned around. Captain Mochi, Lieutenant Bella, and Ensign Pip were staring at him with their mouths open. Their tails were straight up in the air, vibrating with excitement. They had just watched their giant, clumsy, heating pad human bark a 7-foot wolf out of the room. Lieutenant Bella walked up to David and rubbed her head aggressively against his shin, marking him as her property. Captain Mochi's collar crackled. Specialist David, she said, her voice filled with a new level of respect. You have teeth. David smiled and patted her head. I just don't like bullies, Captain. The weeks following the inspection by General Vark were the quietest and most peaceful David had experienced since arriving at Station 42 Alpha. The station was running at peak efficiency, mostly because David had finally fixed the cooling system to allow 4 warm zones near his desk without melting the servers. The dynamic in the room had shifted from a strict military hierarchy to something that looked a lot more like a strange family unit. Captain Mochi still gave orders, but they were softer now. Lieutenant Bella still patrolled the perimeter, but she spent most of her shifts sleeping on top of David's computer tower, watching him type with lazy, half-closed eyes. Ensign Pip, the enthusiastic tuxedo cat, had essentially become David's shadow. Wherever David went, to the cafeteria, to the bathroom, to the airlock, Pip was 3 steps behind him, tail held high, acting as a tiny, fluffy bodyguard against any imaginary wolves that might return. One Tuesday afternoon, the routine was broken. David was deep inside a mess of wires, fixing a holographic projector, when the lights in the room suddenly dimmed. A spotlight, usually reserved for interrogation protocols, snapped on in the center of the room. Captain Mochi sat directly in the beam of light, sitting taller and straighter than David had ever seen her. She was wearing a small, ceremonial cape made of red velvet that was tied around her neck. Lieutenant Bella and Ensign Pip were flanking her, sitting at perfect attention. The atmosphere was heavy with solemn importance. David swallowed hard, wiping grease from his hands onto his jumpsuit. He wondered if he had done something wrong. Had he bought the wrong brand of tuna? Had he moved a chair without permission? He walked slowly to the center of the room and stood before his tiny commanders. Specialist David, Captain Mochi's caller announced. The robotic voice was set to maximum volume, echoing off the metal walls. Step forward and kneel. David hesitated for a second, then knelt on one knee, bringing himself down to their eye level. Captain Mochi looked him over with her large, green eyes. She cleared her throat, a sound that the translator interpreted as a static click. She began to list his achievements. She spoke of the Battle of the Vacuum Cleaner, where he defeated the Loud Devourer without fear. She spoke of the Great Freeze, where he sacrificed his own body heat to preserve the command crew. And finally, she spoke of the confrontation with the Wolf General, where he displayed the ferocity of a true Deathworlder to protect the honor of the Felid Empire. You have exceeded the parameters of your contract, Mochi declared. You are no longer just a biological heat source. You have proven loyalty, bravery, and the ability to reach the top shelf where the treats are hidden. Therefore, the High Command, which is me, has authorized a promotion. Ensign Pip stepped forward, holding a small velvet box in his mouth. He placed it gently on the floor in front of David's knee. David looked at the box, feeling a genuine lump in his throat. He had expected a reprimand, or maybe just a request for lunch. He didn't expect a ceremony. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the box and opened it. Inside sat a new identification badge. It was made of heavy, polished gold metal, far superior to the plastic card he had been given when he arrived. David squinted to read the engraving. He expected it to say, Chief Systems Engineer, or Security Officer. Instead, the bold, laser-etched letters read, Supreme Guardian and Keeper of the CAN Opener. Below that, in smaller text, it said, also, The Pillow. David stared at the badge. He looked up at the three cats, who were watching him with intense pride. They didn't understand human job titles. To them, this was the highest rank in the universe. He was their protector, their provider, and their bed. It was an honor. Do you accept this burden? Lieutenant Bella asked, her raspy voice unusually soft. David clipped the heavy gold badge onto his jumpsuit, right over his heart. He smiled, a genuine, tired smile that reached his eyes. I accept, David said. It is an honor to serve. The solemn mood instantly vanished. Excellent. Ensign Pip chirped, breaking formation to bounce around David's legs. Promotion ceremony is complete. Now, according to protocol, we must feast. Open the holy cabinet. The wet food. The one with the shrimp. The three officers abandoned their dignity immediately, rushing toward the kitchen area, meowing and tripping over each other in their excitement. Later that night, the station was quiet again. David lay on his makeshift bed in the corner, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. He wasn't alone. The weight on his chest was heavy, but familiar. Captain Mochi was asleep on his sternum, her ceremonial cape acting as a blanket. Bella was draped across his legs, and Pip was curled into the crook of his arm, snoring softly. David looked out the small porthole window at the stars streaking by. He had come to space looking for adventure, for high-tech challenges, for a serious career. Instead, he had found this. He was a glorified furniture item for three small aliens who thought he was a god because he had thumbs and a warm body. He closed his eyes, listening to the triple-engine purr that vibrated through his ribs. He wouldn't trade this job for anything in the galaxy. He was the Supreme Guardian, and his shift was just beginning.